That morning was just a beautiful, serene morning. Had the windows down.
We will be starting in just a few minutes, and just a little request for you guys who are sitting towards the back. They would really like it if you could move in and a little more towards the front and center if possible. Just putting that out there. If you're comfortable to move up, that would be great, and we will be starting in just a few minutes. Well, welcome back, everyone, from lunch. I hope you're much cooler in here than you were outside. We are entering the final stretch of this two-day conference on hate crimes in places of worship, and the history that we have learned yesterday and today has been eye-opening of the things we think we know and of what we actually know. And so a very, very special thank you to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and the FBI Birmingham Division for putting this together for the community and showing us how the three work together. Next up, prepare yourselves for the next phase, the gift of our wounds, finding forgiveness after hate. How profound that we are in this place where we get a chance to talk about that. Welcome, please, Pardeep Kalika, who's the Executive Director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, and Arnaud Michaelis, author and motivational speaker, as they present this next segment.
Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello? Okay. Hello. All right.
Hello.
We're hot. All right. Good afternoon. Sat Sri Akal. Namaste. Salam. Shalom. We are honored to be here. This is going to be, we're going to be talking for quite a while, but we want this to be a participatory event. So if somebody has a question and we want to get to it sooner than later, I think, should we just do it where people raise their hands?
I think questions on the fly would be great. If you have a question as we're speaking, please just raise your hand and we'd be happy to answer on the spot. No questions are off limits. We answer a lot of questions and really appreciate tough ones and especially questions that we've never had before. So don't be shy.
We truly appreciate everyone from the intelligence community to the faith community taking on this tough discussion. It is tough, and we're going to tell our personal narrative of what happened on August 5th, 2012. As I was speaking to Cornelius and really, we were kind of hammering out the logistics. I appreciate being in this building in the sacred space. It's because me and Arno have alluded to what happened here for the past 7.5 years, and really the inspiration of what happened in response to the 1963 bombing and the way that your community has really thrived and really made, even just when I was downstairs looking at the memorial, we have been able to visit religious places and places that shootings have happened, from schools to synagogues to masjids, churches, all over the United States. And one of the things that sometimes what we see is that there's no reclaiming of sanctuary, if that makes sense. There's not a purposeful reclaiming. And so that is, for us, it's inspirational to see that. Me and Arnold are brothers. I know sometimes we don't look like brothers, but we are brothers. And we're going to share a video of how we became brothers and how we all are each other's brothers and sisters.
Morning, had the windows down, thinking to myself, like literally thinking to myself, this is a beautiful morning. Life seemed, it was just great. I start to see squad cars flying by us. The squad car pulls up in front, like tapes it off real quick. I asked the police officer, like, sir, what's going on? And he's like, son, there's a shooting that happened at the temple.
Police say the shooting began around 10:30 Sunday morning as many inside the Sikh temple were gathering for worship. Witnesses said the first shots came outside, inside mayhem.
I felt anger. But then I felt this sense of relief that like I wasn't involved in that. I also felt this incredible sense of guilt. For the past 5.5 years, I've continued to wrestle with those two feelings, survivor's guilt and survivor's relief. I am just appreciative to live this life, but I also have this guilt of I'm not doing enough.
You guys all hear that? When we breathe in suffering and we breathe out healing.
Serve to Unite was founded in response to the August 5th, 2012 Sikh temple shooting. It was a means for the Sikh community to transform this atrocity into something inspirational that would bring people together from that day forward.
It was initially formed to bring about an awareness of the Sikh community, but then we knew that it was going to morph into something much bigger than that to really address communal healing for all communities.
Today, Serve to Unite works with young people from 2nd grade through college. We do arts-driven service learning and global engagement. We also organize a 6K run every year to raise money for scholarships for 6 young people in honor of the 6 victims of the Sikh temple shooting. And recently, Pardeep and I have started working with small towns and municipalities, trying to help them become comfortable with demographic change as populations are changing.
We're weaving in our parts of ourselves into a map of Milwaukee to end the segregation, to bring everybody together.
There's places where people are just not as unified, and if we have a chance to change that, we should definitely do it. Especially with Milwaukee being like that, we should do as much as we can.
So this is the bullet hole that was left by the shooter as he was trying to shoot into the women that were here. He was just shooting from back here. And then Dad's final resting place was in this room, as was the other priest who was working. So, and he gets out here, and as these responding officers are coming to the scene, they engage in a firefight with Wade Page. And Wade Page takes his own life. The shooter killed himself. There was not much explanation from law enforcement, so I said, let me reach out to Arnold and really find out why white supremacists do these things. In a selfish kind of way, I also wanted someone to raise their hand and say, you know what, I'm responsible for this.
In 1987, me and a few friends of mine started a White Power Skinhead gang in Milwaukee. We started our own White Power Skinhead band also, and our band was very much a rallying point for like every pissed off white kid in Wisconsin.
We must secure the existence of our race and the future of white children.
We stoked their anger and their angst, and we blamed it on Jewish people, we blamed it on people of color, we blamed it on gay people. We later got involved in the early stages of what today is known as Hammerskin Nation, and that's the largest organized white power skinhead group on the planet Earth. So nowadays, when violence is perpetrated by this group, I feel a great deal of responsibility. And speaking of which, Wade Michael Page, the man who murdered Pardeep's father and 5 other people, was a member of that group.
I brought that to my buddy Paul.
Basically brought about an inner conversation where I'm saying, where do you get off thinking that you're going to go waltzing off into the sunset after all of the people you hurt, after all of the harm you've done? I left the movement in 1994. On paper, we couldn't have been more different, but when we sat down and talked, we saw how much we had in common, and it hit us at that point, like, we need to work together. We got to do something together to basically get this message out to the world, and the more people we can help understand this, the better off we're all going to be.
Oh yeah, the murals. We had a group of people who painted murals on the walls in our school, and they had positive messages and things to bring the community together. We've also been doing art. We like to connect art.
People of the high school age, that they're the next generation. So it's important to me for them to have a good community for themselves which will bring a better community for the younger generation and for generations to come.
If we're going to be the antidote for what's wrong with our society, we really got to focus on what's right. In my experience, what's right is the truth that human beings have more in common than different.
The more voids that a child has, the more vulnerabilities. So filling those voids with sort of wraparound programming, it takes a village to raise a child. And somehow, some way, we step back from that saying. But I think that saying is more true now than ever. It takes the village to really nurture a child.
To have amazing people in my life like Pardeep Kalika, who have taught me so much and who love me and I love them. Pretty much every day I am literally in this state of joy and gratitude. That's what life's all about.
Peace and love.
Pardeep and I met in October of 2012, which was a couple months after the attack that happened on August 5th, 2012. And we've been working together and traveling and telling stories since then. And we've done many, many speaking engagements. And at most of them, we always draw upon the tragedy and the suffering and the hatefulness of the attack that occurred in this building and that took the lives of Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. As I look at the photos of these young ladies, I'm just absolutely heartbroken to imagine these lives cut short and what they could have contributed to society and the love that they could have brought to the world that was so tragically taken from all of us when this attack occurred. On August 5th, 2012, a white nationalist named Wade Michael Page, who, as mentioned in the video, was a member of the gang that I had helped to start, attacked the Sikh temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek. And he murdered Satwant Singh Kalika, Paramjit Kaur, Suvig Singh Katra, Prakash Singh, Sita Singh, and Ranjit Singh. Those names, along with the names of Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise, and along with the names of people who have been lost in so many other senseless attacks inspired by hate and violence in our country and around the world, are going to live on in our society. These four little girls lived on in every talk that Pardeep and I have given. Their story is part of our story now, as is the story of the 6 people slain in Oak Creek, Wisconsin on August 5th, 2012. And I can't help but to think of the concept of the American dream. What does that mean? What is the American dream? And who is it for? Today, I can't think of a better example of the American dream than the story of Pardeep's father and his family. But there was a time in my life when I had zero respect for the American dream, and I didn't think it was anything that anyone was deserving of if they weren't white. So it'd be awesome now if Pardeep can share with you a bit of his story and his family's journey. And again, as we're going, feel free to ask questions.
So our journey in this country began in 1982. And my parents decided that they wanted to leave their homeland, which was in Dugal. Both of my parents were farmers. My mom, and it was typical at that time for women to only go to school, or girls to only go to school until 5th grade. So my mom graduated from 5th grade, and she started to work inside the house. My dad had graduated from high school, and they started to work on the farm. Once they got married, the first time that they actually met each other was when they got married. Talk about having to adjust to one another. That's how it was. We lived in this small rural village, and I think my mom, going back and in retrospect and talking to her about our book, and she goes back and she just says she didn't want to work on the farm her entire life. She wanted a better life for her children. One of my uncles he already moved to America. He was a veterinarian, and he told them about this American dream that Arno alludes to. Things can be better if we leave our homeland and we go to this place, and we can have a better life there than the one we would have led back if we stayed home. And I think that's what really symbolizes a lot of the American dream. Me and Arnold, through our work with a lot of refugees, a lot of asylum seekers, a lot of immigrants, and they say nothing different. They say nothing different besides, why did you come to this country? Because I wanted to have a better life for my children than the one that I would have led if I had stayed wherever I stayed. That's what we all want. We want a better life for our children. So we came here in 1982, and I'm usually in town when I'm making this talk, so home is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And for those that are familiar with Milwaukee, Wisconsin and the Midwest, know that sometimes it gets a little bit chilly and cold. And that's definitely true. And so sometimes when I talk to my mom and say, why Milwaukee, Wisconsin? Like, you couldn't have chosen a more like tropical place.
Like Alabama, maybe.
Yeah, maybe Alabama at 95 degrees. So that's when we got up this morning. I'm like, how hot is it going to be? So we wore our shorts here, and we got dressed in the car.
I apologize to the two ladies that were in the car next to us. I didn't realize they were there until I had already been changing.
So full disclosure for all intel, we were trying to be respectful of the church and the Baptist community. We know we like to dress up when we go to church. But going back and really thinking about the journey that my mom and dad had. I asked my mom the question. I said, Mom, how did you first feel when you came to America? And sometimes her words don't really match the questions that I ask because there's sometimes translation difficulties. And she said, big. And I had to understand what that kind of means. And she said, big. Okay, that's not the typical answer that comes back. You mean are the people big? Or like, what's big? And she's like, everything was just so big. And then I thought to myself, here's this person who had graduated from 5th grade, did not speak a lick of English. Here's this farmer who graduated high school, really wasn't a city person, really barely spoke English himself. Move halfway across the world, right? Not a country, but the world. And go to this place where everything seems so big. And I think about the bravery that we must have going forward. I think about the bravery that they must have had to do what they did. I think about the bravery that our ancestors and pioneers have had to do what they do, to live through what they lived through, and to still be here standing. So as we go through our immigrant journey in this country, I remember moving to the north side of Milwaukee. The north side of Milwaukee historically has been hit by a lot of social policy, public policy, that has led to the deterioration of the city itself. And when we moved there in the 1980s, that's kind of what was happening within this urban sprawl, was that it seemed like the jobs, there was employment exodus, where a lot of the good-paying manufacturing jobs that my parents came here for were starting to leave town. And then there was more people fighting for those good-paying manufacturing jobs. And over time, it seemed like those jobs just completely left and the very minimal paying jobs were left in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Throughout that process, I watched my parents struggle. I watched them move from neighborhood to neighborhood, searching for a safe place to live. We lived in every part of Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, from the north side to the east side, west Dallas, south side, and finally to the suburbs. And that was in correlation to how they were doing in life. So they thought that they could move themselves out of a dangerous place. They could move themselves to a safe neighborhood, only to find out that on August 5th, 2012, in a relatively safe neighborhood, a white supremacist gunman who did not believe in any of their dream would kill 6 people and then take his own life. By that time, I became the first one in our family to graduate from college. My father had successfully made it as a small business owner. He ran gas stations. My mom worked at those gas stations. And over time, they became financially secure. You could have said that they had achieved their American dream, only to have somebody say, and not just words, but actions, that this American dream was never meant for you people. Not only was it not meant for you to live this American dream, not only did he say, you are not welcome here, but he took it upon himself to say, you're not welcome on the face of this earth. That morning started off as any beautiful sunny summer Sunday morning. And we were on our way to the temple, as many of you get ready to come to the church or the synagogue or the masjid. We were getting ready that morning, and I was getting both of my kids ready. Both of my kids at the time were 4 and 7. And as they were getting ready, my daughter, she's kind of a lollygagger. Does anybody have children here? Anybody got children that can sometimes lollygag? And you're kind of like rush them along, right? And what do? You get more frustrated because you're like, let's go, we got to get to church, or we got to get to the Gurdwara, or we got to get somewhere really quick. And what does that do to them? It confuses them. And so I'm confusing her, getting her ready, and she, eventually we get into the car. And once we get into the car and we start to drive to the Gurdwara, she, about a couple minutes into the drive, she lets me know, Dad, I forgot something at the house. I don't know how much gas prices are here. In Milwaukee at that time in 2012, gas was near $4 a gallon. And so now I'm weighing in my mind, should I go back? Should we go get this red notebook, or should we just proceed forward? Eventually, just the sort of look on my daughter's face made me say, go back and get this notebook. So we went back and we got this notebook. And I remember a lot of things vividly that day. One of the things that I remember is the look on my daughter's face when she ran out with this red notebook. And as she's running outside the house with this red notebook, she's happy. Meanwhile, I'm mad. And she's like, hey, I got the red notebook. I'm like, hurry up and get in the car. You already wasted $4.18 worth of gas. So I'm hurrying her back, and we're ready to go. She gets back in the car, and on our way to the Gurdwara, we start to notice something very peculiar. And we start to notice that there are squad cars coming from all different jurisdictions. One of the things that I did not mention, before I was a clinician, before I was the director of Interfaith, I was also a police officer for 5 years. The same neighborhood that I was talking about, one of the toughest hit areas in Milwaukee, was where I was a cop at. It's got its own documentary called 53206. And when I noticed all these squad cars going by us, I thought to myself, what could be so devastating that you need to have a reaction like this? I was about to find out.
As I tell my story alongside Pardeep's, it never ceases to really hit me how I was born with the American dream literally handed to me on a silver platter. All of the things that Pardeep's family had to work so hard to achieve over a period of 30 years, I had from day one. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood in a suburb of Milwaukee called Mequon. Mequon's very well-to-do, very conservative, predominantly white to this day. I wasn't abused by my parents. My parents were together. They both loved me very much. They let me know that at every turn. And in fact, all the adults in my life as I grew up not only like loved me and supported me, they were fawning over me. My whole childhood, people were just like, he's so wonderful, he's so gifted, he's so special, he can accomplish anything he wants to accomplish. And so at first glance, it seemed like I had the ideal childhood that anyone could ask for. But underneath the surface, there was dysfunction that led to my suffering. Now, a lot of the work that Pardeep and I do nowadays, we work with young people from second grade through college, as you saw in the opening video. We also work with communities and entire small towns and municipalities, helping people deal with demographic change and just change in general, which I think is a very primal human issue, is that change is something that we're afraid of and it's hard for us to deal with. There's a theme that comes up in much of our work, and it's very simple, and it's simply that hurt people hurt people. I believe this truth wholeheartedly. I have a deep faith in this truth, and what that means to me is that all violence in the world, all violence in human history, whether we're talking about a genocide or we're talking about a horrific history of slavery and colonialism, or we're talking about a nasty comment on Facebook or bullying in the hallway at a school, all violence stems from suffering. If a person has a sense of inner peace and they have a sense of faith and wellness, they have no reason to commit violence. They have no reason to be hateful. Now, as we work with young people, maybe a talk or two ago, somebody asked, like, what's the best thing about working with young people? And I always answer, because they teach us so much. They have so much to teach us, and we have so much to learn from them. And as an example of that, I was once working with a group of middle school students, and I'm going on about how hurt people. And one of the students, who was probably 12 or 13, raises their hand. They're like, yeah, but Arno, not all hurt people. And I'm like, oh, yes, that's true, actually. And it's a very, very good point. It's a very important point. Because as my Buddhist faith likes to go on about, suffering is part of life. Everyone suffers to one degree or another. Everyone experiences some kind of trauma or another. And fortunately for us human beings, not everyone passes that trauma on to other people. Fortunately, most people find a healthy means to process that trauma. And when you do have a healthy way to process trauma, be it a faith tradition or a strong family, or even a dedication to art or music or academics, activism, a career, those things can help us process our pain so that we don't transfer it to other people. Now, as a child, I had every means you could imagine, again, handed to me on a silver platter, to process the trauma that I was going through. And I failed to engage with any of those offerings that I had available to me. My trauma as a child was essentially my mother's misery, which was largely caused by my father's drinking. My father is an alcoholic. He wasn't an abusive drunk. He was more of a fun drunk, When my dad was drunk, it meant we were going to shoot guns and light off fireworks. What's more fun for a little boy than that? Pardeep has told me that that's actually not a normal way for people to grow up. But in my childhood, like, that was the norm. We had a pistol range in our basement.
That's not normal either.
Yeah, it was not normal. But when my mother was trying to sleep at midnight after working 2 jobs to keep the bills paid and the lights on in her nice house in a nice neighborhood, my dad would be in the basement, oftentimes with my brother and I, shooting a Colt 45, which made it difficult to sleep, to say the least. My mother's relationship with my father was miserable. They fought constantly, really about the financial pressures that his drinking put on the household and the stress my mother went through to try to backfill the finances to keep the household running. And rather than be a good kid and be like, hey, Mom, I love you, what can I do to help? I just started to distance myself from her and distance myself from my father, who loved me very much, despite the disease he struggled with. And of course, as I distanced myself from the adults in my life who were there to love me and support me, my suffering grew worse. And that's when I started lashing out at other kids. I began as a bully to my younger brother, first of all. And I understand that knowing Pardeep and his brother and knowing all sorts of other siblings, like sibling scuffles and rivalries and whatnot are not an uncommon thing. But once again, in my life, I took that to new heights, as my little brother was my first bullying victim. And I used to do things like, because as little kids are kind of not fond of pungent things like yellow mustard, I would pin my little brother down and take a yellow squeeze bottle of French's and squirt it in his nostrils until it came out of his mouth. And I'd punctuate that by spitting in his face. And he would reply by coming after me with butcher knives and things like that. Like, that was my early childhood. And I wouldn't venture to blame all of this on my father's drinking. The person that I am then, or I am now, as well as the person I was then, is a combination of nature and nurture. A lot of this is my personality issues and who I am, for good, bad, or ugly. But that, combined with this alcoholic household and combined with the suffering that I felt seeing my mom suffer, is what I believe led to me starting to lash out at other people. Now, of course, this is all like Monday morning psychoanalysis. I don't have any letters after my name that denote being a mental health professional. Pardeep does. And over the 7 years that we've known each other, I think I've gotten a little bit of that through osmosis.
Oh, yeah.
So looking back, I could kind of put a finger on events in my childhood, and I say, okay, this is why I was acting this way, this is why I was acting that way. But at the time, of course, I'm not cognizant of any of this. I'm just in the midst of it all. So as I started lashing out at other kids, bullying on the school bus, fights in the schoolyard, I started to get a kick out of it. I started to get a thrill from causing havoc at school, from lashing out and not just making other kids afraid of me and causing them pain, but seeing parents freak out at me and teachers freak out at me. Like, that was my addiction. And there are a ton of parallels, I believe, to violent extremist ideologies of any sort and addiction in a broader sense. I am, like my father, I'm an alcoholic as well, so I'm very familiar with substance abuse in that sense. And looking back, I can see I had an addiction to the thrill of disrupting things. When I first started drinking, I was 14 years old, and I drank probably 4 or 5 beers, and I passed out. And I drank like that for another 20 years until I was 34. By the time I quit drinking, my magic number of how many beers I could drink and still function the next day was 18. If I drank more than that, then I wouldn't go to work. But I could drink 18 beers and still function the next day. It's an example of how, when you're abusing a substance, you have to constantly escalate the amount of that substance that you intake in order to get the same kind of buzz. So it got old after a while to just bully kids on the school bus and bully kids in the schoolyard. So I went from that to breaking and entering to vandalism. When I started drinking at 14, things got exponentially crazier. By the time I'm 16, I'm a full-blown alcoholic. I had been violent since I was a little kid, so violence is very familiar to me. It's something that's comfortable to me. I convinced myself that I like to fight. And being pretty uncoordinated and clumsy, I got hit in the face a lot, so I convinced myself I like to get hit as well. That's who I was at age 16. And on top of that, to me, hate was just another part of this thrill-seeking that I was addicted to since childhood. I believe that every human being who's ever been a teenager has had at least one split second in their life when an adult, a parent, or a teacher tells them that they can't do something they really want to do, and that teenage hormones are rushing, and you're like, ooh, I hate you. And fortunately, for most of us, it just passes. You feel that rush of frustration and hormones, and then you get back to being a somewhat reasonable human being. For me, that hate was just another part of the rush. So when I had that feeling, I grabbed onto it, and I ran with it. And I wasn't just like, ooh, I hate you, but I hate this teacher, and I hate this school, and I hate society, and I hate cops, and I hate the government. Like, that's who I was when I was 16 years old. And it was then that I was exposed to white nationalist ideology through white power skinhead music.
On our way to the temple that day, and as we start to notice these squad cars going by us from different jurisdictions, I know that if you get a multi-jurisdiction response, something is going wrong, wherever that is going wrong at. What I noticed also was that these squads were following the same direction that I was going. I'm just pulling over to the side. And as I get to the intersection down from the street from the Gurdwara, I noticed a police car just kind of go in front and start to barricade the street off. Like I said, I'm kind of a cheapskate, and I've already wasted about $4.18 worth of gas. So the last thing I want to do is go drive around some more and waste some more gas. And if you don't take this right turn, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you will waste a lot of gas coming out the other side. So something else just told me, get out of the car and ask this police officer what's going on, what's happening. Usually, typically, I wouldn't have done that. But that day, I just get out, I put my car to the side, I got both of my children in the back still. And I get out and I ask the police officer, sir, what's going on? Why can't we go down the street? And he looks at me and he says, son, there's been a shooting down the street and the scene is not secure. And I kind of just, what? And I know I heard what he just said, but sometimes when we're in disbelief, we just say what as sort of a reactionary what. And maybe there's part of me that hoped that he would say something different, but he didn't. And he says it again. And I remember at that time just this rush of hatred that came over me, this disgust. When I was a cop, we used to wear what was called dress blues, meaning that we had blue uniforms. This police officer was wearing a tan, sort of like brown tan sheriff's uniform. And I remember looking at him, and he's right here, and he tells me this bad news. And I'm looking at him and thinking to myself, that's got to be the ugliest poop-colored uniform, because we're in a church, poop-colored uniform that I've ever seen in my life. And I remember just like that was all this tragedies happened down the street. My mom and dad are inside the Gurdwara, and I'm thinking to myself, you got to be wearing the ugliest poop-stained uniform I've ever seen in my life. And sometimes that's what happens. I can look back and think, why was I thinking that? Sometimes the bearer of bad news gets it. Sometimes the person closest to us gets it. People that are in our lives on a day-to-day basis sometimes receive the ugliest part of us. That the part that's angry at the world but can't tell the world that we're angry with it. So we take it on the person who's nearest and dearest. I wouldn't have said that that police officer was family, but that police officer was proximal. He was right there. And through my disgruntlement, I asked the police officer, when did this shooting happen? When did it all start? And he tells me 10 minutes ago. So now I think back at my forgetful daughter and how she came out of the house and how much gas I wasted and all of these things, right? All the things that we sometimes think are so important on a day-to-day basis didn't seem so important. And I sit there and I struggle. Because typically in my life, I've been able to do things and maneuver. But now this police officer is saying I can't go forward. I can't help those who are inside. And at that same time, I felt a sense of relief. Like, thank God she forgot that notebook. And now I think back to even how I feel about my daughter and how happy she was when this red notebook, and how I'm sitting there in that car steaming, right? Just hurry up and get in the car, let's go. And I think, why do I think about those certain memories all the time? I know the police one. I can self-analyze myself or self-reflect to say that we take things out on the people that are nearest and dearest. But why the obvious, my daughter forgetting her notebook? It's because sometimes we don't make our children a priority. And that day, what saved my life was simply making my daughter a priority. Today, I have 4 beautiful children. That time I had 2. And what I try to do on a day-to-day basis, and what we try to do with our students, is just be accessible, make them a priority, and as much as we get to talk up here, we try to listen, and we try to maneuver, and we try to have them understand the role of their experience within the world. That day felt like one of the longest days of our lives. We sat there waiting for news of our loved ones. What actually happened that day, you saw a little bit of it on the video. What happened that day, and I think about when I was downstairs and the time frame that the bombing here happened, 10/22, was about the same exact time that that shooting started, 10/22. When the shooting started, 2 brothers were outside in the parking lot, and he parked his. So when we think about tactically, when you see something that alarms you, this shooter that day parked the nose of his truck to exit. Where the temple is a very soft spot, meaning that it's a soft target. It's way off the street. So if you were inside the temple, you could not, if there was something going on, you couldn't tell from the street. The street is one of the busiest thoroughfares in all of Oak Creek. But yet you can't see all the way back. So as we're building these places of sanctuary, of worship, I try to warn municipalities, don't build it so far so that it becomes a soft target. This was a soft target. And the only way in is the only way out. So when you drive in, so this driver drives in and he parks the nose of his truck pointing out, meaning in a getaway position. 2 brothers outside approach him because he's parked in kind of a distinct way that nobody would ever come there and park like that. And as they approach him, those 2 become the first 2 victims. 2 children saw it happening. Typically the children play outside, and these children were playing outside. They saw it happen. They run inside, and these 2 children saved a lot of lives. They run inside and say there's a shooting happening outside. At that time, it was unheard of. So that's why the disbelief. And right now, I know it's become commonplace and common news. But in 2012, it wasn't common news. Right? This was one of the deadliest hate crimes committed by an affiliated white supremacist since 1963, 50 years. So it wasn't common news yet. When they ran inside, everybody kind of heard the gunshots happening outside. So they found their little hiding spots. When they found their hiding spots, there was 2 women who were coming out of their places of worship, out of the area where we have the pews and stuff. And as these 2 women came, the first shot that rang in between them. And it hit the frame of the door. When it hit the frame of the door, one of the women went inside, the other woman ran to the kitchen area. He followed the woman that went inside, and now she's in this area, and she's a sitting duck. And he executes her. She became the only woman to die that day. And as he is looking for other victims in the actual sanctuary where we keep our holy book, where we keep the Bible, we call it the Guru Granth. He's looking for other people. Other people are able to find hiding spots. He comes back out because there's nobody in there, and he goes and follows where the lady went and runs after her. Over there's people that are hiding in closets. My mom at that time found a hiding spot in a closet, and he's shooting that area up. And as he's shooting that area up, he doesn't know the lay of the land, so he's just kind of just shooting. A couple of people were hit in the hand, some other people were hit other places. And then he leaves that area because he doesn't realize how many people. By this time, that time in the morning, the very devout come because they're coming there to make food, get everything prepared for the day, right? So there's not that many people, but at that time, 50 people were there. He comes back out of the kitchen area, and he runs across the hallway, the shooter. There, he approached an 85-year-old man. The 85-year-old man was looking for a hiding spot as well. And when he saw him, he executed him. And so he would lay in the doorway. After that, he goes into the bedrooms. And he could hear people making phone calls to 911. He goes into the far bedroom. Now the far bedroom had 3 people in it. The first person, once he knocks over the door, was executed right there. There was another person who was in there who took 2 shots to the stomach. The shooter runs out of ammunition, so he has to reload. Once he reloaded, the other person was able to get away out of that room, and then Dad was there to try to fight him. And Dad tried to fight him and try to hold him and hug him, right? And try to not have him be able to reload. But the shooter was military. He became an affiliated white supremacist after that. Now some people say that he could have become that during his time in the military. But what we know is that he became one after that. He was a great shot. And so he reloads, and Dad is the last person kind of left in there trying to fight him. And so he takes 5 shots, all right here. So close quarter shots. There's a window near that area, and the window kind of lets you know and lets you see outside. He saw that police officers were responding by that time. And so he goes outside, and remember that truck that was kind of parked with his nose out? He tries to run back to that truck and get away. Meanwhile, a police officer, Lieutenant Brian Murphy, engages in a firefight with him. And now they're shooting at one another. Lieutenant Murphy's shot missed him. His shot hit Lieutenant Murphy right in the throat. And when it hit him in the throat, he just went down. Because it was just a vulnerable spot. And as he goes down, for some reason the shooter became so enraged in this firefight that he thought that he needed to go and execute him. And so he goes over Murphy's body and plugs him from close distance. And he's standing right over him, shooting him. He took 15 shots. 14 from close range, 1 from distance. Meanwhile, other officers are responding. The next officer that responds is Sam Linda. When Linda, and I tell you all this because we kind of discussed, and Murphy's been part of the discussions before, and the next officer is Sam Linda, and what he does is he rolls right on him. And the smartest thing that he did was, once he rolled on him and saw what was happening, initially he thought that the shooter was kind of waving him over, officer down. But once he got close enough to see what happened, he realized that that was the shooter, and so he had to go in reverse. And he got himself into a tactical position, meaning far enough back to be able to access his rifle. Once he accessed that rifle, he was able to take a good shot at the shooter. He shot him once, put the shooter down, and then the shooter took his own life. So all of that happened within 6 minutes, beginning to end. The lasting impact of that is there's families who still grieve. There are communities who still feel vulnerable. There's one man who is now 7.5 years later who is still stuck in a vegetative state. 6 people dead. The shooter dead. 7 people dead. Lieutenant Brian Murphy was able to survive by the grace of God. Today, he speaks up and he speaks about tactical situations. He speaks about getting to know our neighbors, doing community policing, getting to know who is in our neighborhood before we need to respond to a hate incident. Our life as a community would also change, because what community wants to be defined by what happens to you? We did not want to be defined as what happened to us. We want to be defined by what did we do with it? How did we respond? Right? Pain not transformed is transferred or consumed. We did not want to consume that much amount of pain. So we knew that we had some transforming to do. We had to look inward and we had to look outward.
I first visited the Gurdwara in November of 2012, and it was an evening of celebration, actually. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and the people at the Gurdwara had decided they were going to have a celebration called Heritage Day, where people from all sorts of different backgrounds, ethnicities, nationalities, faith traditions were all invited to the Gurdwara that evening and encouraged to share of their faith tradition with everyone else at the Gurdwara. This was also the first time that I spoke with Pardeep. We had met not even a month earlier, and it was that day he calls me up. He's like, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" "Nothing." "You're speaking at the Gurdwara." "Okay." And so I'll never forget that first visit. And the first thing that really blew my mind is just how warmly I was welcomed by everyone there, especially the Sikh community. Just person after person after person was like, "Oh, you're the guy. You're the former white supremacist." And I had a big box of my first book, which I self-published so I can get copies pretty cheap. And I was very just honored to hand them out to everyone at the Gurdwara. But I'll never forget when you visit the Gurdwara in Oak Creek, which I encourage you all to do if you're in the area. And for anyone not familiar with Sikhi, a very important part of Sikhi is a community meal called langar. And it's amazing. I love Indian food, and langar is basically like all you can eat really, really good vegetarian Indian food. So I implore you all to visit the Gurdwaras in your neighborhood and take part in this community meal, which isn't just an all-you-can-eat buffet, but it's an exercise in community and sitting down and eating together and experiencing the divine together. So I always think of langar when I think of the Gurdwara. But the other thing that will really strike you when you walk in is you'll see the door to the prayer hall, and you'll see that bullet that Pardeep talked about this bullet hole in the metal door frame. It was the one bullet hole that was left after the temple was cleaned up and repaired. And below the bullet hole, there's a plaque that says, "We are one." And nowadays, to me, that thought of "we are one" means bearing witness to suffering unconditionally. And especially bearing witness of the suffering of people who may not look like me, to people who have been the targets of hatred for centuries. And that's another reason why it's such an honor to be here in the 16th Street Baptist Church, is to bear witness to the suffering that happened here and is still reverberating from 1963 and will still be reverberating 50 years from now. Thinking and reliving that scene that Pardeep just described, the horror of a place of worship being attacked, I think of how visceral it is and how real it is. And I know firsthand from knowing Pardeep and knowing his mother, knowing his family, how the suffering initiated on August 5th, 2012 still reverberates today and how real it is. And I think back to my story and how I convinced myself when I was 16 that I was the one who was oppressed and I was the one who was suffering, when I really didn't have any factual basis for my oppression narrative that drove me into white nationalism. A question I get very often is like, how did you become racist? Were your parents racist? Were you raised that way? Neither of my parents were racist, neither of them are racist. My mother is a quintessential child of the 60s. She's super progressive, very liberal, very multicultural. At my mother's house, we have faith-based artwork from every faith tradition you can imagine. We have Hindu artwork and Christian artwork and Muslim artwork. We have I always forget the name, the horrible thing to do on Rosh Hashanah. The little thing the Jewish people put on the doorway. Yes, we have one of those in our house when you walk in, and we're not remotely Jewish. Like, that's who my mom is, and she's been that way my entire life. Growing up, my mother's best friend, and her best friend to this day, is a Liberian woman named Yetta, who came to the United States and married a white guy, and they had 2 kids. And I grew up, my brother and I grew up hanging out with these 2 kids. And my mom is so fascinated and enamored of other cultures that she really wants to experience them firsthand. And I'll never forget when I was about 8 years old and my brother was 5, Mom came home from Yetta's house with cornrows in her hair. Now, this is personal preference maybe, but I just don't think that cornrows are a great look for white women typically. And my mother at the time, some people may or may not agree with me. My mother at the time, my mother's a very beautiful woman, and she was then too, but she had very pale, pasty white skin and like jet black hair. And so with cornrows, her head was just kind of like, wow. And she comes walking in the house, and my brother, my dad, and I, and my brother just kind of like sit there stunned. And my brother, I think, started crying at age 5. And it was the next day, Mom went back to Yetta's house to have the cornrows taken out.
Did you see a lot of scalp?
Yes, you could see a lot of scalp. So it was a pretty shocking look. And that's just, to me, that's how I describe my mom. She loves human beings, every human being there is. And the idea of hatred or prejudice to her is just absolutely counter to everything that she is. My father is politically the polar opposite of my mom. My father is very, very conservative. I like to call him a capitalist fundamentalist, in the sense that he believes there's absolutely no problem in human society that can't be solved if we just get the government out of the way and let the invisible hand of the market work its magic. And as destructive as I believe that outlook is, and I say this considering myself a capitalist, I think capitalism is great if it's stewarded and backed with a very healthy social safety net, but without digressing further into politics, my father has these very deep political beliefs, but at the same time, he's always been fascinated with Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion. So he's this really weird mix of like kind of Buddhist curious, occult curious type stuff with being a capitalist fundamentalist. And I don't know how he reconciles it all, but at the same time, my father is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. He has this intellect that you can just kind of feel when you're around him. Pardeep's met my father. And he's also one of the most compassionate people that I've ever met in my life. And at no time did he ever think less of someone because of their skin color or think more of himself because of his skin color. There have been times when my dad has like literally given homeless people the shirt off his back in poor weather. So I didn't get the racist beliefs from my parents. Looking back again with the Monday morning psychoanalysis, I think what attracted me to the swastika was really that it so repulsed civil society. Now, prior to becoming a white power skinhead, I was a punk rocker. And I still love punk rock. I don't want to make it sound like punk rock is some kind of gateway drug into becoming a white power skinhead. I think there's a lot of good things about the idea of punk. I think it's healthy to question authority. It's healthy to think for yourself, to not conform, and to do things for yourself. But when I was 14, 15, into 16, to me, punk was just about breaking things. It was just about lashing out. It was just about rebellion. I didn't have any sort of deep thoughts about conformity or thinking for yourself. It was just like part of my addiction to making people angry. I'd been doing that since I was a little kid. Now I come across punk rock, and it's this loud, fast music with all sorts of cussing and saying all these offensive things, and I'm like, whoa, this is awesome. Well, if you think Mohawks make people angry, or punk rock music makes people angry, try a swastika. Swastikas really make people angry. And I wasn't ignorant as to why people were repulsed by the swastika. I wasn't ignorant as to why it made people angry. I had studied the Holocaust in an English class I had my first year of high school. But again, with the parallels to substance abuse, I didn't care why the swastika made people angry. I only cared that it did. As I mentioned, I'm an alcoholic. I've worked with a lot of people who are in recovery from abusing other forms of drugs, methamphetamine, heroin. And when you talk to people in that recovery process, they'll tell their story of addiction, and they will talk very plainly about how they knew how wrong it was to steal things to support their habit, and sometimes even prostitute themselves to support their habit, but they didn't care, because all they cared about was getting that fix. And to me, as a 16-year-old, that's how I was. I didn't care how wrong it was to run around with a swastika and adopt these racist views. I just wanted the thrill that doing so brought me. So as mentioned in the video, me and a couple friends started our own white power skinhead gang in Milwaukee. I had been screaming in punk bands for a couple years prior to that, so we started our own white power skinhead band. I have been head over heels in love with music my entire life, and I still am, for good, bad, or ugly. And it's kind of ironic because I really don't have a lick of musical talent. Sometimes people ask me like, oh, do you still sing? And I'm like, I never sang. It wasn't singing, it was bellowing. It was just screaming real loud on a microphone, like getting the crowd crazy. And I was good at that. And our band was like a rallying point that drew all these angry white kids together. As my friends and I radiated hate and violence out into the world around us, the world reflected those things back to us. Now, as I mentioned to Curtis upstairs, I'm not only a former white nationalist, I'm also a former information technology consultant. I'm not going to discuss that too much because it was just too traumatic a time in my life. That's a joke that really only IT people will get. But I mention it because you're talking about input and output, the same way computers work. When we queued up that video, I sat down on the computer up there, I typed in a web address or a search term, and the computer, my search term was the input, the computer gave me the corresponding output showing that video. Same thing happens with our phones or any other sorts of technological devices. But the world that we live in, the society that we live in, is also a system. And it produces output according to our input. So as my friends and I are inputting hate and violence into the world said, oh, you like hate and violence? Here, have some back at you, oftentimes in multiples. And within 6 months, my friend who I started the gang with, who played guitar in my band, shot a kid who came to do a drive-by on our house. Within 2 years, another very dear friend of mine who I shared a birthday with, he was exactly 1 year younger than me, was shot and killed in a street fight as he was out practicing hate and violence as I had taught him to do. And rather than take these misfortunes that we really brought upon ourselves as a wake-up call, as a healthy, sensible person would have, we spun them to suit the toxic ideology that led to the misfortune in the first place. So it wasn't my friend's fault that he shot this kid, it was the Jews' fault. Everything was the Jews' fault. It wasn't my other friend's fault that he was out drunk and picking fights the evening that he picked a fight with someone who had a pistol who killed him. It was the Jews' fault again for bringing all the black and brown people here to our white country, of course being in complete denial that this land was taken from indigenous peoples. All of this required a huge amount of energy to constantly spin reality to suit our ideology. That was exhausting. The other, probably most frequently asked question I get is, how did you change? What led to your turnaround? And the one-word answer to that is exhaustion. The exhaustion came from all sorts of directions. It was exhausting to constantly spin my day-to-day life to suit this impossible, toxic ideology that my day-to-day life contradicted with at every turn. It was exhausting doing things that I knew were wrong. I knew it was wrong to hate people and attack people. And there were times even as I was hitting someone where this voice inside me is saying, what is wrong with you? Why are you acting like this? You are a horrible person. And I didn't have the courage to even acknowledge that voice, much less answer it. So I'm constantly expending energy to suppress that voice. I had to disconnect myself from all of the world that contradicted the ideology. I grew up a film, TV, sports, and music geek. I still am to this day. I love all of those things. And as a white power skinhead, all of those things are forbidden. They're all seen as part of a Jewish plot to kill all the white people on the planet Earth. As ridiculous as that should sound to any thinking person, that was my reality back then. And I couldn't watch a lick of TV or a movie out of Hollywood or cheer for the Green Bay Packers. I couldn't do any of that without feeling that I was a traitor to my people. And that was ridiculous and it was exhausting. But what was most exhausting was when people defied me and they defied my hostility and instead treated me with kindness, especially when I least deserved it. And there was nothing more powerful than when people I claimed to hate refused to knuckle under to my hostility and instead demonstrated for me how a human being should treat another human being. And I really want to emphasize this aspect of defiance. Everything I did back then was meant to provoke hostility. It was meant to cultivate hate in the world. So when people hated me for who I was, and keep in mind now, I was a white power skinhead. I wasn't some normal looking white guy who like snuck off on Saturdays and put a Klan hood on. I was a guy who you could just look at a glance and be like, there's a racist. I had a shaved head. I was constantly like covered with scars and stitches. My clothes had swastikas on them. I had swastikas tattoos. I had big steel-toed boots with red laces. It didn't take a genius to know what I was all about. On top of my look, I was very outspoken about it as well. So I don't think anyone was confused about who I was and what I was trying to say and what I was trying to accomplish. And lucky for me, throughout my 7-year involvement in hate groups, there was time after time after time when people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, black and Latino coworkers, refused to capitulate to my hostility by reflecting it, and instead treated me with kindness. I dropped out of high school when I was 16 years old because I'm a gifted genius. I don't know if I mentioned that, but my mom says, so you know it's true. And being a gifted genius, what need do I have for high school? So I quit and I moved out of the house, and I moved into a house with a bunch of punk rockers who we steadily drove out and replaced with skinheads. Now, my mother is a very practical person, and her and my dad tried to keep me in school. They tried everything they could, but they had really pretty much lost control of me entirely by the time I was 16. And so my mom, being practical, said, well, if you're not going to go to school and you're going to move out, like, you need a job because we can't afford to float you. So she had a high school friend named Jack Cooper who had a t-shirt printing business. And she called up Jack and pleaded with him to give me a job, and he's like, sure. And so here I am at 16 printing t-shirts for 40 hours a week, third shift. When I went to work, I was, again, this plainly visible racist, very outspoken about my racism with all of my coworkers, and I would wear swastikas on my jacket. This got back to my mother, who did pre-press artwork for the shirts that I printed, and she was humiliated. She was mortified. She called up Jack, who is Jewish, to let him know that she would understand if he fired me. In fact, he was like, I would fire him if I were you. Like, I wouldn't put up with this. There's no reason you should have to put up with this. As through her tears, she's saying that her son, her number one son, that her whole world revolved around, was the type of person who didn't deserve to have a job, was someone who was bad for society. And rather than fire me, Jack said, he's a good kid. He's just going through a phase. And not only did he let me keep my job, he hired my skinhead buddies. My buddy Pat, who later went to prison for shooting that kid, and I'm happy to say Pat has turned his life around now too. He served a number of years in prison, and he came out, and he's now married and has two amazing sons, and he's very much committed to a society where everyone is valued and included. But Pat today, as he did then, has a voice that makes my voice sound like a prepubescent Swedish boy. And Jack gave Pat a job selling the t-shirts on the phone. So he would be calling up t-shirt shops in a mall somewhere going, hey, do you want to buy some Metallica t-shirts? And people would be like, good. He actually sold a lot of t-shirts. So here were my friends and I, and again, this speaks to the lies and the toxicity that white nationalism is rooted in. In real life, my friends and I had means to support ourselves thanks to the good graces of a Jewish man. And there were numerous days when I would come to work drunk or hungover, and I rarely would have a lunch for myself because I was too irresponsible to pack my own lunch. And there were times when my black and Latino coworkers would share their lunches with me. Rather than see me starve, even though they knew I was a racist, they'd be like, hey, skinhead, you hungry? Come have half this sandwich. And hunger is a pretty powerful motivator. I certainly didn't want to take a sandwich from a black man, but I got up anyway and I snatched it out of his hand. I didn't even say thank you. I go back to wolf it down in the corner, glaring at everybody in the break room. And he didn't really bat an eye. He just like ate the rest of his lunch and went back to talking about the Packer game with our other coworkers. And of course, I love the Packers. I'm from Wisconsin. I want to, oh yeah, wait, I can't talk to them. I hate black people. That's right. And so it was this living, breathing hypocrisy and spin that was driven home by the kindness of very brave people who must have been so adept at kindness that this was a normal state for them. It's easy to be nice to nice people. It's difficult to be nice to people who are in really bad places and are lashing out at the world around them. But that's when it's most important and it's most transformative. And all of these exhaustion factors built and built until after 7 years, I was so exhausted I couldn't do it anymore. But I needed an excuse to leave because I was leading this drastic double life. In the movement, as we called it, I was like king, rock star, skinhead, war god. I was a founding member of Hammerskin Nation, this global skinhead organization. I was the lead vocals of Centurion, this band that sold 20,000 records around the world. We had groupies, we were partying. People all over the world knew who I was. I was a reverend in a racial holy war. I had all of this false, inflated status that at the surface looked like it was a big deal, but I knew it was all hollow and as fragile as a house of cards. Because in real life, I'm a high school dropout alcoholic in my early 20s who can't hold a job and pay his bills because he's too much of a drunk, has to keep moving back home with his parents, and he actually has a tendency of drinking until he passes out and urinating all over himself. Like, that's who I was in real life. And so the idea of giving up all of this and like facing the cold reality of this was pretty intimidating. But the exhaustion was so great that I was ready to face that. And what drove it home and what made it happen finally was in early 1994, my girlfriend and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. And I became a single parent to our 18-month-old daughter. A couple months after that, after a concert that my band had played, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight. And by that point, I had lost count of how many friends had been incarcerated. It finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter.
That day, August 5th, we realized that we not only had an individual journey to make, but we had a communal journey. And this is a small minority group in America. It was, I'm fascinated by choice. And the choice that day that people made was, Sunday morning, people could have gone home after their place of prayer worship. And as they start to get alerts about what is happening at the Gurdwara, they decided to come and bear witness. And this was first it started off with 50, then 100, then 200, then about 1,000. And even within the misery of what was happening that day, it was never lost on us that we will never be alone. And that the human spirit will not allow that to happen. And so these are people who have been draped in their faith, in their cloth, and honestly draped in love. And this was so much of a habit to them that they couldn't find themselves to go home. 7.5 years later, one of the things that fascinates me about choice is that there are people who still continue to show up, continue to hear this story and this journey. You are a continuation of that same legacy. The people that are here today, we cannot always be in different states and different places, but the human will is so strong that it understands suffering and says, no, you know what, it's not going to happen. And we're getting to a place where we are seeing the divine in each other. Yesterday, you had an interfaith gathering. As Arnold kind of alluded to, as far right underneath that bullet hole, it says the first tenet of Sikhism, Ek Onkar, meaning we are one. Nanak, the founder of Sikhi, right, came from a long history of trying to show people how we share this oneness. It is tragic that it needs to happen that way. That something miserable needs to happen before we show up. But we also understood sacrifice, martyrdom. We call it shahidi, some people call it qurbani, right? What is our sacrifice going to be for? What was the sacrifice of those 4 little girls? What is still happening in progress? Where are we vibrating in the consciousness of the Spirit? Why do people right now, as they should feel more connected than ever before, feel more alone than ever before? Why does research show, hey, research shows that 30%, 40% people report feeling lonely or alone. But yet we're connected. It's because we're not truly spiritually connected. It's a fake connection. And that is something that we have understood over time. So not only did our community need to heal, but we need to also individually heal. We need to become whole. I didn't know that at that time, because people would say things like, Pardeep, you need to practice forgiveness. Pardeep, we need to be compassionate. Pardeep. And I would say, what does forgiveness and compassion have to do with any of this? And I was very much justified in my anger and in my frustration. I could have said, where was everybody when this was happening? While this child, we will call him a child, Wade Page, and we will give him a name, because he's not just a monster that came out of nowhere. He was somebody that grew up in this country. He went to the military. He was discharged. He watched Columbine happen in his own town. He broke up with his girlfriend a couple weeks before and was able to legally purchase a firearm, even though he was on the FBI, at the ADL, the SPLC's intelligence reports, as a known affiliated white supremacist. I could have very justifiably been, you know what? Everybody dropped the ball on this one. So let me sit in my bitterness. But then I remembered, and we all do remember who we are. In moments of crisis and tragedy, we remember what cloth we are draped in. Right? We think about Jesus' final 10 words. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. As the Roman soldiers are sitting here, tearing apart his clothes. Oftentimes we say, where is the Father? Where is God? Well, obviously God is external, is outside of us. But then I think, have we not thought about the internal? Do we give less relevance to our own internal being of forgiveness and our rightfulness in being angry and being sad and grieving? And I think about all of the lessons that we've been taught. To me, before this happened, Sikhi and Sikhism didn't make sense. Neither did Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. The sacred did not make sense. We went to the Gurdwara, but we really didn't feel it. Right? Now, the transformation was, how do you help this community heal? And I said, we say, and Dr. Singh will know this. Every time we do ardas, as we leave for the day, we say, Nanak Naam Chardi Kala Tere Bane Sarbat Tapala. And Chardi Kala means relentless optimism. Nanak Naam Chardi Kala Tere Bane Sarbat Tapala means for the peace and prosperity of all mankind. Mystic. We said that every day before we left. And optimistic about what? Optimistic that the moral arc of this universe bends to the good. And always will. But at the time, I didn't really feel it. You see, I was searching for answers. I wanted to know what we all want to know. The whys, the wheres, the what. Who was he? Why did he do what he did? The shooter was dead. He wasn't going to come back to explain to me why. Because sometimes, in my mind, I think that to be able to do the what, we really got to understand the why. Okay. So I reached out to a person that I thought could explain to me the why. And the first time that I reached out to Arno, I wanted him to explain to me. Say, why did the shooter do what he did? Did you know him? I was searching for an explanation. Sometimes we all search for explanations. But what I was really searching for was an experience. And the experience was, how do you not explain compassion, not explain forgiveness, not have somebody tell you what it means. How do you experience it? And so, when we first met, I met him, and I met with all the reservations that any of us would meet somebody with. I'm going to meet, how does that even sound? 2 months after your dad's killed by a white supremacist. Hey, honey, I'm going to go meet a white supremacist out for dinner. What do you think my wife thought? She's like, you lost your mind. And this white supremacist started the same organization that the shooter belonged to. And all of a sudden, once a white supremacist, always a white supremacist. And I had to kind of think to myself, had I lost my mind? Did I go to a place where I was not coming back from? By this time, I knew that I would sleep next to my kids and hug them longer than I probably should. I cherished moments. And oftentimes my wife would have to come get me, and I would be sleeping next to their bed, and she'd be like, come on, let's come to bed. And I couldn't tell her that, hey, I just like sleeping here because I feel secure. I feel safe next to them. I want to watch them a little bit longer. And so she was kind of thinking, like, something's going on. And something was going on. She was right. What was going on is that I didn't take life for granted anymore. I was cherishing it. In every moment, in every conversation, every bit of dialogue, I could learn from them, they could learn from me, but I didn't take things for granted. And I was starting to live the life that I was probably supposed to live a long time ago. We all take things for granted sometimes. We think tomorrow is promised. It's not. There's a beauty in that, though. The beauty is that you get to discover how precious that moment right there is. We all co-create this existence. If one of us was missing from this existence right now, it would not be the same. It'd be different. We cherish this. We love this. We love y'all. And really that's in the spirit that we move forward with, is love. And if there's any questions. Mm-hmm.
That's a fantastic question. The answer is that, first of all, the white supremacist ideology it's a very big tent, and the common tenet of the tent is anti-Semitism and racism. The belief in racial difference, first of all, and then racial superiority combined with rabid anti-Semitism. Beneath that tent, though, there are all sorts of different subgenres. There is a subgenre called Christian identity, who, if you ever have the misfortune of sitting down with this person, or maybe it would be curious, who knows, but you'd certainly need a lot of patience. They can open a Bible and point to passages where they believe it says plainly that Jesus was a pure-blooded Aryan white man, and that, they missed the whole skin of bronze, hair of lamb's wool part. And they also believe that the white race is the true lost tribe of Israel, and that Jews and people of color and everybody else are the spawn of Satan. That was never my particular racist jam. I've actually, if you guys go to my YouTube, which is My Life After Hate, there's a talk there called Me and Jesus, and it was actually the first talk I had done in a church. And I talk about how for my entire life, up until I became a Buddhist, the past decade or so, I was vehemently anti-Christian from every possible angle you could imagine. As a white nationalist, I believe that Christianity was part of the Jewish plot to kill all the white people on the planet Earth. When I left the white nationalist movement, being a man of extremes, I went from being a violent, hateful racist to a peaceful, loving raver, shaking my butt to house music at 4 in the morning on Sunday in the south side of Chicago with 3,000 people of every possible ethnicity, gender identity, socioeconomic background, sexual orientation, and loving every minute of it. And I hung out with a lot of gay people back then, and I then at that point I saw Christianity as this like, they hate gay people. So I mean, I've literally like opposed Christianity from every possible angle it could be opposed from. It wasn't until I really started to study the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, and really like feel my spirituality as a Buddhist, that I'll never forget, I'm reading like a Thich Nhat Hanh book, and all of a sudden I'm just like, oh, if everyone was a Buddhist, there'd be world peace. And I wanted to run and grab people by the collar and be like, have you heard the good news about the Dharma? And then I'm just like, whoa, who do I sound like now? I sound like those Christians that I've looked down upon my entire life. And then I challenged myself, and I said, you know what, why don't you open yourself to the teachings of Jesus Christ and see what they're really about? And as I did that, and as I started working with some amazing Christian people, it hit me that the teachings of Jesus are a very beautiful thing, and that if that inspires someone to work to be the embodiment of love and forgiveness, then more power to them. Like, we can't have too many ways to do that as human beings. So that's like my spiritual journey briefly, but as a white nationalist, I was as opposed to Christianity then as I was the rest of my life. And I agree, it's ridiculous. Actually, back in the movement days, I would get in fist fights with Christian identity guys. And I also never really had a high opinion of the Ku Klux Klan, because they're always on about we're white Christians, and I'm like, I ain't Christian, dude. And they'd kind of backpedal and be like, oh well, but you're a good Aryan white man and you're a white warrior, and I was like, yeah, I was at odds with them as much as I was anybody else. So there certainly are strains of white nationalism that the same way that the so-called Islamic State twists the word of the Quran to justify their actions. Going back really to the history of slavery and colonialism, there have been white people who use the Bible to justify racism and imperialism, genocide, all sorts of horrible things, going up to the days of the Ku Klux Klan, who are the United States' oldest homegrown terrorist group and have done things to make ISIS look tame for over a century, and they've done it in the name of this book. So that's certainly a thing, but it wasn't my thing.
Supradeep and Arno, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, opening up your heart. My question is for you, Arno. It's a two-part question. It comes from my background being a physician, so pardon me if I'm asking you things as I try to see things.
Sure.
Looking at what brought you the anger, do you think there's a way for us as a society, as a medical community, to diagnose that early on? And I'm very intentionally asking that question the way I ask it, because I can see the world clearer when I see it like that. And second part is that exhaustion that took 15 years to occur, is there a way we can actually multiply that exhaustion for someone like you at age 16 or 18 or 20 by some mechanism that we can multiply that so rapidly that you exhaust in 2 years rather than 15 or 20? So can you give some thoughts about those?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. I think to answer the first part of it, if we're gonna, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, which is basically a philosophical exercise of reducing something to its simplest form. And if we're looking at young people, or really anyone, and we're wondering, are they at risk of violent extremism or these ideologies, it's the question we're asking is, are they connected to the rest of society? Yes, then cool. No, well then how do we connect them? Our program that Pardeep and I run, Serve to Unite, is an exercise that does that through arts-driven service learning and global engagement. So we ask our young people what issues in society they're concerned about, and over the years they've answered everything you can imagine. And then they roll up their sleeves and start working side by side to address those issues. And nothing makes you feel connected like doing that actual work alongside another human being to improve things in society. Our young people have addressed issues like racism and religious intolerance, of course, but also homelessness and veterans issues and genocide prevention, human trafficking, environmental issues. And anytime you can bring people together to be like, hey, you know, we may vote for different people, but we both agree that our community needs this women's shelter. So what are we going to do to make this women's shelter happen together? And when they and that this is all from Sikhi. You know, it's Sikhi 101 and Seva and Ikankar. It's embodying those principles, which of unity and service, which are common to really all human spirituality, I believe. So that's that. I think that's the first question. The second question: how do we accelerate this? The first thing to come to mind is a man that I've worked with since 2016 named Chris Buckley. Chris was a Imperial Nighthawk in the Ku Klux Klan. Now, not to minimize the horror that the Klan has let loose upon the world for a very long time, but at the same time, we're talking about a bunch of grown men who call each other Nighthawks and Cyclopses and wizards and dragons and things like this. Chris was a Imperial Nighthawk, which meant he was a bodyguard to the Imperial Wizard, who was the national leader of that Klan group. And when I met him in 16, he was not only an Imperial Nighthawk, he was also in the throes of methamphetamine addiction. So this guy was a mess, as bad as I ever was, if not worse. And I've been taking him on that crash course ever since. So I spent 7 years in hate groups from 87 to 94, but really the bulk of the transformation has happened between 1994 and like 2009, which is when I first decided to go public with my story. So we are talking about a very long span that I've traveled to get to who I am today. And as I worked with Chris, and which was very difficult. There were times where it was all I could do to not go back to old school Arno and be violent with him because he was so difficult to work with and also so offensive to me now. When I hear people using racial slurs, they're using language to dehumanize my best friend on this earth and so many other people in my life who I love and who love me. So I was very angry with Chris many times, and rather than throw him a beating like he's never been beat before in his life, I would take a deep breath and connect with my meditation practice, and I'd be like, okay, who's in control of this situation? Am I in control or is he in control? And I would keep coming back to be like, when I met Chris, President Obama was in office, and he would say all kinds of ridiculous things, and I'd be like, okay, Chris, you know, someday we'll sit down and have a discussion as to whether or not President Obama is coming to cut your head off and put you in a FEMA camp. But right now, I'm here because your wife is concerned about her husband. She's concerned about the father of her children and the safety of her family. And I just want to let you know there's a better way to live your life, and I want to help you get there. And it's been going on 3 years now, and I'm very happy to say that Chris today is sober. He's been clean and sober for going on 2 years. He's been out of the Klan for longer than that. And he has went from being one of the most ardent, vicious Islamophobes I've ever seen in my life to being an advocate for Muslims and refugees and immigrants in this country. And he also helps me on intervention case with white nationalists now. I just got back from Washington, D.C. last week, where I was there with a group called Parents for Peace that Pardeep and I are both part of. You can find out more about Parents for Peace at parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. And we spoke on Capitol Hill, and we also spoke at the Belgian embassy. And Chris was there speaking with me, alongside me. And I was really, to the point of your question, I was amazed at how much progress he has made in 3 years considering all the years it took me to make the progress that I've made. So it's definitely possible to accelerate that process. I think a big factor was, in my case, I was just kind of wandering around, like letting things happen. And fortunately for me, the rave scene happened, and I made friends outside of this like toxic ideology I was involved with. But there wasn't a former white nationalist who reached out to me and said, hey, here, come walk this way. And what I did with Chris, and I fortunately had some resources in working with him, was I took him to Los Angeles from rural Georgia, and we went to an amazing gang prevention intervention agency called Homeboy Industries. It's run by a man named Father Greg Boyle. I implore everyone to check out Homeboy Industries and the work of Father Boyle. He's just one of the closest things to a living saint that you'll find. And when Chris walked into this environment, which was literally former Bloods and former Crips, like baking bread alongside each other, and seeing the power of compassion, Chris I could see he was destroyed by that experience in the best ways. Like all of his hurt was destroyed, and he just came out almost like soaked in his own tears. And I could tell that was the point of no return from him, where he saw that he was not only, it was ridiculous to think he was superior to black people and Latino people of color, but also that he had so much to learn from them and that they were his teachers. And from there, I took him to the LA Mission, where him and I fed dinner to 400 homeless people for an afternoon. And that was really like big steps for Chris, along with other interactions that I had arranged that kind of entailed that crash course that you're talking about. So it can absolutely be done.
The other thing we got to do is we got to start to create a culture that's more understanding and less rejectionist. A lot of times people, as growing up, they feel rejected. And they might not be rejected, but they feel rejected. So I think educational program that how many of you guys are educators or been in educational facilities, or are we mostly intelligence community? Yeah. And so we have ways to measure intelligence. Do we have ways to measure emotional intelligence? Are we creating a curriculum that helps kids address some of their shame and some of the stuff that they're going through inside? I have 4 kids. I don't hear too much about, I do hear about MAP scores and Badger testing and this and that, but I don't hear as much about, hey, you know what if this kid doesn't feel like they belong, right? And Brene Brown said this perfectly. Shame and guilt are 2 different things. Guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am wrong. A lot of these kids that we see that can be certifiably diagnosed personality type disorders believe that they are wrong. So how do you get out of that? You have them be honest with shame. The only way you address shame is through complete honesty. Real quickly, we had a kid out in the school. He was wearing around a Confederate flag and running around the school with a Confederate flag in a mostly white school. And people were kind of complaining about why does that kid get to do this? Why does he do that? And I said, listen, think about what that kid is doing. What are you focused on right now? You're focused on the Confederate flag. So you're rejecting his Confederate flag. You're doing him a favor because he feels like crap. So, but he doesn't want you to look at him and say, hey, we're not even talking about the Confederate flag, but we're talking about you. So what people do when they put these barriers of like hatred in front of them, whether it's the steel-toe boots, whether it's the swastikas, whether it's the Confederate flag, they'd rather say, I want you to look at this Confederate flag and denounce that. Don't denounce me, because I can separate the two, right? So, we have to build a more understanding culture. How do we do that? Oh, you had the mic, so.
No, I'm just carrying the mic.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, good. So yeah, I mean I think that's a great question. But how do you build an infrastructure to do that, right? I can tell you from a clinical model, If we think about diagnoses, from diagnosis 3 to 4 to 5, when I diagnosed somebody, I said, this is what's wrong with you. We're moving away from that model. We're not saying what's wrong with you anymore. We're saying what happened to you. Those are two different questions. If we're saying what happened to somebody, we're kind of saying, okay, what am I going to be able to do about that? When we used to say, what's wrong with you, we're speaking from a deficit place and saying, okay, this is what's wrong with you, and somehow, some way, even as a clinician, if I was a clinician, I said, what's wrong with you? I'm already like up here, and the person that I'm diagnosing is down here. We're not looking at it like that anymore. Mental health communities are starting to say, let's look at it from a trauma-informed perspective. Not what's wrong with you, what happened to you. And if we understand what happened, then we can understand the generational effects and what we can do about it.
Not only that, but just asking that question, what happened to you, gets a person to start facing their vulnerabilities. And I think that's again, in my Monday morning psychoanalysis, it's this terror of even acknowledging your vulnerabilities, much less exposing them to the world, that drives so much of this violence. In the incident where Party was talking about this kid who was running around with the Confederate flag as a cape, he wants to adopt this symbol that he knows is going to be rejected, because then he doesn't have to come out and say, hey, I'm afraid no one's going to like me. I'm afraid nobody loves me. Like, those are hard things for any human being to say, much less a teenage kid who's having a hard time in their life. So it's so much easier to just, you throw your identity into some repulsive symbol and let people haul off on that, then that saves you from having to address your vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another question for you guys. So as you guys were talking, it reminded me of something a couple of years ago, I don't remember what year it was. James Comey, when he was FBI director, came and spoke here in this church. And something he said stuck with me all these years. It's hard to hate up close.
Right.
And I've had mixed feelings with that quote today, having heard about, I think it was Dylan Roof, who was at the South Carolina, the Charleston shooter.
That was the Emmanuel AME shooter, yeah.
Yeah, so he sat in that room with them and prayed with them, spent time with them, and still at the end committed this evil act.
Right.
So he was physically close to them, but not intellectually close with them. So, and what I'm hearing you guys say is that it's kind of, you still do have to be up close, but how do you get up close? I mean, we can have this theoretical concept of, well, we need to know what's behind their actions, what's going on with them. How do you actually do that? I mean, I'm an attorney. I work with kids a lot. I work with parents a lot. I know there's some educators that work with students, and there's a juvenile probation officer here in the audience. So we work with kids. We see this. How do we get the kids to open up and talk about it and get them to look at the person across from them? How do we get adults? I mean, I know adults in the Christian faith who hate Muslims and want them all dead. How do you combat that and get them to open their eyes to, this is just somebody they believe differently?
I think, me and Arnold were talking about this on the way here, but I think people need a more mature relationship with God. And I don't mean to badmouth any preachers, anybody that's out there preaching, because it's a difficult thing to do. But I do say to our interfaith leaders in the greater Milwaukee area, we need to instill these kids with a more mature relationship with God. And that's going to be less prescriptive and more participatory. Meaning I can't tell you, because if I'm telling you, then I'm just telling you. And sometimes these kids are not ready to hear it. But what we don't get, and as far as that incident that happened that day, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I'm not a fortune teller. I would hope that Dylan Roof somehow, some way has a spiritual journey that happens later on, and that he can be somebody who gives back in society somehow, some way. So I just know that, like, when I was growing up, the preachers told me this is what you should believe, and I would ask them why. And oftentimes, us as adults, you know, we tell our kids, this is what you should believe, and they ask us why. And we say, because I say so. Right? We've done this, and it's not enough for these kids right now. It's not enough for communities. All of my congregations speak about how they're losing attendance, how people are not, and then typically it's the older generation that shows up. And I lovingly ask them, are you giving them something that's feeding their soul, or is it feeding your ego? Because if it's feeding your ego, it's only for you. If it's feeding their soul, it's something that you're instilling within them. And that's the hard discussion to have. Is that a lot of this stuff that we're believing in as kids doesn't make sense to us until it makes sense to us. And we need it to make sense to, as the good doctor was saying, early on, and say, how can I make you exhausted of hate early on? How can I make you get to this place where you can contribute while you can contribute and give back? That's the, you know, I think we just need to have, in public schools, we need to have education around what does religion look like. I mean, if we've taken it out of curriculum, but for some people, they can't separate the religion from their life. And we would say, okay, if you're a Muslim, come here, separate that, come from work. We talk to a lot of corporations who the person is thinking about wearing a hijab as they go into work, and don't want to do it because they don't want to be passed up for promotion. What we're kind of telling people is that you need to separate out these parts of our life, and then people are like, well, if how can I do that? How can I separate out between who I am and this part? So, and in a way, interfaith understanding is the key. It's a growing global mission to say, now if I'm a Christian and I understand Islam, I'm develop a more spiritual and more mature relationship with God, because it's just helping me understand Jesus. Or if I'm a Sikh and now I understand the teachings of the Buddha, and now it helps me get to a deeper place within myself. If I only understand myself and how we are, whoever we are, right? We don't really build connection. We just build tolerance.
I would add too that the truth of cultivation has to be considered, and I think it's a really empowering thing to look at anything in life this way. But like a lot of these acts of kindness that I talked about happened in like year one, if not like month one of my 7-year involvement in hate groups. So in Buddhism, every thought we have is a seed that can become an action in the world, and every action in the world is a seed that can lead to other reactions and affect other people. And very often it doesn't happen right away. I'm particularly connected to the Emmanuel AME shooting. Pardeep and I and his brother drove down there, and we were there 36 hours after the shooting. And today I have a dear friend, Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mother Ethel was murdered that day, along with 2 of her cousins and her childhood best friend. And Sharon wrote an amazing book called For a Time Such as This, Hope and Forgiveness After the Charleston Massacre, which I highly, highly recommend. But a lot of people will cite that Dylann Roof was there praying with them for an hour, and that they could not have been more kind and loving to him in that hour. And I don't, but then they'll say that and say, well, yeah, look how well that worked. I can't blame anyone for feeling that anger, but to me it's very saddening to try to cite that as an example of the failure of kindness, because it's to quote the Dalai Lama, if kindness doesn't work, try more kindness. And it's easy for me to say as the straight white guy who had the American dream handed to me on a silver platter, but the Dalai Lama has faced a lifetime of oppression, as has everyone from Tibet. So when he says something like that, it carries a lot of weight as far as I'm concerned. And it just means that we have to really ask ourselves, who's going to make the rules in this engagement? I can tell you from experience that white nationalists, along with the so-called Islamic State, along with extremists from either political pole, they want the rules to be separatism. They want the rules to be aggression and hostility. And when we play by their rules, the odds of us prevailing in this conflict are very, very slim. So rather than allow them to make the rules of engagement, I always suggest that instead you dictate the rules of engagement yourself, and you don't let anybody destroy your faith in God and your faith in humanity, and you proceed from that unshakable spot and dictate the rules of engagement yourself, and make those rules ones about what we have in common rather than what's different. Make those rules about things like kindness and forgiveness and gratitude, and all of which are really like the keys to human happiness. So you can not only like dictate the rules of engagement, but you can make a case for self-interest. And this is what I did with Chris quite a bit, was like, hey dude, if you want to be happy, and more importantly, if you want your children to grow up happy and successful and healthy, like you have to start living that way, and make the case that there's something in it for them, as well as in for the rest of society.
Question before we close.
Sure.
on you all. It's been so fascinating and powerful. I want to know from the community where you are how the greater community responds to you and your message, and then also hate groups themselves, especially for you, Arno. How do they respond to this message of love?
You know, one of the things that is true within these tragedies is that sometimes it doesn't always get better. And for our community, I think it took a long time for them to really understand the impact and what happened to them and what happened to us and our own personal responsibility. And so, you know, you just have to have trust that that's there, and that's I think that's the role of faith, is to see something that others might not see. So I think going down that path, a lot of people couldn't understand what I was doing, and they'd question it. And they said, well, you know, it's too much of this. You don't need to put our community out there. We're going to be attacked again. And so there was a lot of fear. With them, you know, I just said, just trust. Just trust that we're going to the right place. But that takes a lot of, and I was kind of even reflecting, me and my brother took two different paths. My brother was very bitter. He did a lot of things to be able to deflect and not really looking inward. And think about forgiveness, and you know, think about forgiveness for any one of anything that we go through in life, right? There's a warden, and the warden is going to execute a man on death row the next day. He gives the prisoner a choice, and he says, okay, yeah, you know, young man, you can either be executed tomorrow. I'll make your life comfortable tonight. I'll make it easy tonight and make it comfortable tonight. Tomorrow you'll be executed, or you can take that door over there. The prisoner asks and says, what is that door over there? Where does that go? The warden says, you know, to your worst fears. To the scary places that you probably don't want to go to your angst. And the prisoner says, okay, well, you know what? I just want to be comfortable tonight. And sometimes a lot of people do that. They just want to be comfortable. Whatever that comfort looks like. It might be riddled in fear. It might be riddled in separatism. But it's just this conscious comfortness that people exist in. And all of a sudden, they're dead. And they sit on their deathbeds, you know, saying the three worst words that anybody can say. I could have, I would have, and I should have. But then now you can't. Right? So the prisoner chooses, you know, I'll just be comfortable and I'll die tomorrow. Then the other prisoner comes over to the warden and says, warden, what's behind that door over there? And he says, freedom. Freedom. Forgiveness is less about forgetting and more about freedom. Freedom to be yourself again. Freedom to be a father again, a husband again, a wife again, a daughter again. Freedom to be a community member. Because as long as that bitterness exists in your heart, we can't truly fundamentally do this work with that spiritual purpose. We can just kind of placate. And so I knew I needed to do that. And that was an internal battle as well as an external battle. And I think the community now is starting to understand that 7.5 years later.
one of the reasons Party and I get along so well is also one of the reasons that we fight on occasion, is because we're both very pugnacious and we're both provocative.
And I can beat him up.
I have post-concussion syndrome, so I get a concussion if you look at me funny. But we like to challenge people still. I still have that same drive I had as a kid to test people. And today I just try to guide that in a healthy direction. And I think everything the Party was talking about is exactly that. Nothing hampers in your comfort zone. As a Buddhist, I talk a lot about practice, and I'll get a group of kids together. Okay, who practices something? I practice football. I practice violin. I practice writing. And then you just kind of examine practice. How does that look? Well, that first time you tried to play violin, how did it sound? It sounded pretty rough. How long have you been playing? 4 years. How's it sound now? Sounds pretty good. Was it comfortable to pick up that violin the first time you picked it up? No. Are you comfortable with it now? Like how you hold it, how you hold the bow? Yeah. Okay, so you have this very plain example of how something that was once outside of your comfort zone has now come into your comfort zone. And I think we need to do that as a society. As Party mentioned, we're just getting comfortable in very unhealthy places. And that's a human survival mechanism. When you're suffering and you don't know how to get out of it, it's a natural thing to try to find some kind of comfort within that suffering. And you can do that for such a period of time that the idea of not suffering is more terrifying to you than the idea of living with your suffering. And that all has to do with comfort zones. So as a society, yeah, we need to be intentional about getting outside of our own comfort zones, and also mindful that we as a society need to get out of our comfort zone as well. As far as my interaction with active white nationalists goes now, as you can imagine, white nationalists have a very long list of people that they don't like. At the top of that list, above black people, above Jewish people, above anybody else, is the race traitor, which is a white person who is... First, any white person who's not an active white nationalist is a race traitor, but if you're a white person who's actively working against any of the causes of white nationalism, you are like king race traitor. And that's a title I wear proudly now. That it makes it difficult I can't just go walking up to a white power rally and have a meaningful discussion with them. I get a lot of hate mail, and I have through the whole decade I've been doing this, but I've always gotten a slightly larger amount of contact from people in these groups looking for guidance to get out. And I remind myself that's why I do it. And I don't give too much thought to the hate mail. In fact, I haven't got hate mail in a while, and I kind of feel like I'm slacking. So I gotta crank it up a little bit.
Maybe in Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, Alabama is a good place to do that.
We want some hate mail.
That's right. Thank you all so much. We're so grateful that you listened to us today. We love you all.
Quick break. 3:25 is the next session. So we're 3:10. We're actually on schedule. Is that okay? Please, Pardeep, Kalika, Arno, Arno, say it again. A round of applause for them, a quick break, and then we will come back. As you take your seats, I know some people may be downstairs getting that quick break in, but we are going to proceed with the rest of the program. And I just, with the last presentation, as they said, 8/5/2012, 9/15/63, how this church and the temple there in Wisconsin, the connection, even the time of the tragedy, how that ties us together, and how the information that we are learning and that we've learned since yesterday, the most powerful thing, I think, is that example of seeing what love can do versus what hate could do, to see how they chose to be tied together by love, and how that has propelled them into taking this message and this story into communities, as they said, sometimes where people get uncomfortable, and those are the places that they want to go, to make us uncomfortable in those places that allow us not to see what could cause harm in our communities. I want to bring up Hector Morales, Special Agent from the FBI Division in San Antonio. Sutherland Springs church shooting, another one of those horrible headlines as journalists that we had to share with everybody around the world. Sutherland Springs, Texas, another city and state known by tragedy. He's going to share with us how law enforcement helps communities turn the page and move forward.
Thank you. So before I get started, I just want to go ahead and mention that I was supposed to be doing this presentation with another member of the FBI, a unit chief of the Victim Services Division. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it out. That unit's pretty busy because they respond almost to every one of these mass casualty events that happen across the nation. And so he was busy with El Paso and Midland, Odessa. Those are the last two that just happened. So, but because I work so closely with him at Sutherland Springs on what I'm going to be discussing with y'all, he was okay with me presenting the PowerPoint, and I feel comfortable presenting it. So before I go into the PowerPoint, I guess I just need to set the stage on what happened at this house of worship. So it's November 5th, 2017. It's actually the 8-year anniversary after another mass shooting that occurred in Texas. It was 8 years after the first Fort Hood shooting in Texas, where Nidal Hasan murdered his fellow Army service members. And so it's 8 years after the fact. I'm home. I think I just returned from church myself. And one of the hats that I wear in San Antonio, I wear several hats, but the reason I was invited here was to talk about this because I am what's called the senior team leader of the evidence response team. And that basically is like the FBI CSI investigators. So any of you CSI fans, basically that's us. Not quite, but something like that, right? So we go ahead and collect evidence. So that's the reason why I would be receiving a call once it became known that a mass shooting had occurred at this house of worship in San Antonio. So I get the call saying, hey, there's reports of a mass shooting at this church in Sutherland Springs. And just to kind of give you guys a picture, if you think about Birmingham, Alabama, Sutherland Springs would be like if you were heading towards Auburn or Tuskegee, right? Not quite as far. It's only about 35 miles, but just if you were heading in that direction, southeast from Birmingham. Well, Sutherland Springs is southeast from San Antonio. So, and I've been in San Antonio already for, at that time, 13 years or something to that effect. So I find out where it's at, and my job is to get out there, right? I have a team in San Antonio, I have 24 other evidence collectors on my team, and I have 3 team leaders. So I call my team leaders, say, hey, get the team ready. I'm going out to the scene so I can try to get an understanding of what's happening, because I got to brief my bosses, like the special agent in charge in San Antonio, and I know that I'm going to be getting a call from my unit at FBI headquarters. Basically, they're going to be calling me just saying, hey, what resources did you guys need out there? What happened? What resources do you need? So bottom line is, on this Sunday morning, an individual decides that he's going to shoot up this church. So he goes to the church, and I'll show a picture here later, but basically starts shooting from the outside of the church into the church. So he goes to the right side of the building. If you imagine, it's like this sanctuary here, except a lot smaller. There's only 2 rows. So there's one row right here, there's one row right over here, and there's a middle aisle. A back door and a side door, right? So he goes to the right side of this building and starts shooting into the church, right? And then eventually he makes his way out to the back of the church, enters in, and then just starts shooting all the folks in the pews, basically, right? There was video of this incident because the church was recording their worship service, right, like they always do on every Sunday. And so there is video of that. We in the FBI were fighting the release of that, and I don't know where it stands, but we are fighting the release of that video. But there is a video showing that this guy basically, for the next several minutes, just goes up and down the aisles, just shooting into the pews left and right, just repeatedly, reloading, and then starts again, right? He's wearing all black tactical gear, and he's got a face mask on that has an imprint of a skull on it, and he's wearing, ear protection. He's got a rifle, and he's just shooting up and down the aisle, and sadly murders several people inside the church. 2 end up getting outside the church, but they expire on the outside of the church, and then 1 dies at the hospital. So it's one of the deadliest shootings in a place of worship in Texas. It's actually one of the deadliest shootings in Texas, I believe, and the 5th deadliest in the United States, sadly. And so as the shooter exits the back of this church, in the meantime, somebody in the neighborhood, a citizen of that neighborhood, hears this gunfire, right? So that citizen grabs his rifle, right, and heads towards the sound of the gunfire. And they meet. The citizen, he's across the street, hunkered behind a vehicle. The shooter comes out, and they exchange gunfire. And so this citizen with a rifle, who's also a former NRA instructor, hit this shooter twice. And the shooter gets into his car and takes off from that scene. Well, while this gunfight is happening between this citizen and the shooter, another citizen of that neighborhood happens to be at the intersection observing this. So the NRA instructor, the citizen with the rifle, goes and gets in the car, and they give chase. They chase this individual, and it's a high-speed chase. They're after this, behind this person for a good 5 to 7 minutes, until the shooter veers off, crashes into a ditch. So this citizen and the other citizen, they just take cover behind the vehicle, and they wait for the police to arrive. They assumed that somebody had called law enforcement, and somebody had, in fact. And so when the police arrive, they go ahead and take over. They approach the vehicle, and the shooter is deceased. He had committed suicide, right? And so that ended the tragedy here, this murderous act at the church. And so a lot of chaos happens in less than 20 minutes from beginning to end. And we have many people murdered inside the church, and the shooter is dead as well. So now we start arriving. Now, I mentioned earlier in an earlier presentation that we, the FBI, we don't have jurisdiction on the vast majority of these incidents. But the reason why we deploy is through executive order from the president, and we deploy to these scenes, and we find out who is in charge of that scene, and we just start offering resources at under the authority of the SAC, right, the special agent in charge. And so we'll bring evidence response team. We'll bring our SWAT teams. We'll bring victim services advocates. We'll bring folks from the media, any other agents to do interviews. We bring a whole bunch of resources to the scene, and we ask, how can we help? So when I got there, the local sheriff's department had already made the decision to allow the Texas Rangers, right? How many of y'all see Texas Ranger Walker, right? Right? Those guys, right? And gals. And they were going to be in charge of the scene. Their crime scene unit was in charge of the scene. But because in Texas we've been to several, I was mentioning during lunch to some of my colleagues that I've been to 5 or 6 of these mass shootings already in Texas where we've had to respond. I've worked with these Texas Rangers before. So I went to him and said, okay, how can we help you? And so we came up with a plan, which was basically we were going to divide and conquer. We were going to take different parts of this church scene. So let me just show you some slides of the church. There it is right there. As you can see, there is a large law enforcement present there, right? And everything that you see in that slide, right? Remember I said that he went around the right side and then went inside. All those yellow flags you see there are rounds that we identified or spent casings that we saw on the grounds that we're marking because we're going to photograph it, we're going to collect it, that type of thing, right? And of course the shooting happened inside the house. So those folks right there, those are some of the Texas Rangers I was mentioning. Right? This is the city of Sutherland Springs, very small town, right? It maybe covers 5 or 6 blocks, right? If you look at that photo, you can see now all the response vehicles. We've got the Sheriff's Department, the FBI, the Texas Rangers. We set up an area for us to start working and taking care of doing what we need to do. And on the far side of there, you see all those vehicles lined up. That's the media. Right? That's the media showing to cover this event. It becomes basically a media event. A lot of press is going to be there, right? So that's why we go to these scenes, because we want to be able to assist, because it's not that the locals or the state or officials do not have the ability to handle this, right? Because they do. They're very capable, but it becomes overwhelming, so we're just a force multiplier for them. As you can see, now we're starting to do our thing. We divide and conquer. We have different techniques that we can use to measure bullet trajectory and impacts and that type of stuff. The Rangers are there. They're doing that. And you can see that front door, how it has those are all markers of bullet holes or bullet impacts in that front door. All right? So one of the things that we offer in the FBI is out of our Victim Services Division. And those are victim specialists. They're in the local field office, they're at headquarters, they have a rapid deployment team, and an event like this, they can deploy and come out and provide services. Basically, their sole focus is the victim, next of kin, or surviving victims. And they're there to just help them go through this process, having gone through this, like what resources are available to them. And so one of the things that the Victim Services Division does is personal effects. As you can imagine, there was over 20 people were inside that church that were murdered, right? And so you got purses, phones, shoes, jewelry, all types of personal effects is what we call it in there. And they're here to see, well, what can they do? How can they help us with that? I, as an evidence response team leader, one of my jobs is to identify and properly document the evidence that may be in that scene. And that may include inside purses or phones or in the clothing. So I have to make sure that whatever I need as evidence stays there, because I'm there to assist the case agent or the investigators build their case if the case needs to be built. But then there's stuff that is not evidence. It does not need to be collected for that purpose. That stuff can go back to surviving victims or next of kin. And that's where the Victim Services Division comes into play. And that's what you see here. That's my team assisting the Victim Services Division with the personal effects that was deemed not to be of evidentiary value. And so we found ourselves a workspace, and we started helping them clean what we could, right? There's some stuff that can be cleaned by us right there on scene. And the reason we do that is so that we can give it to next of kin or surviving victims right there on scene, the stuff that we can. There are other stuff that we cannot do that, right? And I'll show you a slide of that here in a little bit. That has to go to a third-party vendor. And so that's what we're here. We're here assisting them figure that out. What can be cleaned here? what needs to be sent to a third-party vendor, and we need to catalog that so that we can give it to the proper individuals if they want it back. And that's what we're showing there. The stuff that can be returned, we put in one type of packaging. The stuff that it cannot be returned, we put in hazard bags to be thrown away. And stuff that cannot be returned or needs to go to a third-party vendor, we put that yet in another type of packaging. And the purpose is, at all of these scenes, there's going to be some kind of family assistance center where folks can go after one of these events happen, right? They're going to want answers. They're going to need to talk to people. They're going to want to know if they can get back some of the personal effects of their loved ones. And so that's what we're doing. That's what's depicted here. This was a family advocacy center that was sent up, or assistance center, I should say, that was set up there in Sutherland Springs. And the victim services specialists, they sit down with surviving victims or next of kin and start going through the process of returning some of these items to them. Right? We make sure that we catalog it because we don't want to return the wrong thing to the wrong person. We don't want to lose anything, misplace anything. So this is just some of the things that we do. We have a good system to go ahead and identify what needs to be identified. And it's not just personal effects that may be inside the location. What about all the cars out there that might belong to surviving victims who are at hospitals or next of kin? We still got to also deal with that. So we take a whole, we take everything into account and try to come up with a method to return everything. All right? So here, sadly, is one of the victim's ribbons. Okay, this is what it looks like before. But after we send it to a third-party vendor to have them clean it, this is what they're able to do. All right? It's quite a transformation. And you never know what a victim may want, what a next of kin, the next of kin may want. So we're constantly, the victim service analysts, I'm working with them, they're working with the victim. They're trying to make sure that they're trying to find out what is important for you, what would you like. Here's another example. This is simply a check. Right? This is a check that was cleaned later. Right? So they're able to just do amazing work. This means a lot to the victims. We are cognizant of that, and we work very hard with the Victim Services Division to make that happen. All right? This is something that's just not a on-scene process. A lot of that stuff was collected as evidence. Later on, the Texas Rangers determined it was not needed as evidence, so now the Victim Services Division reached out to me again and said, hey, we want to go ahead and see if these items can be returned to next of kin or to surviving victims. We just need a place to go ahead and catalog it and review it and see what we can clean and what we can send off. So we did it again months after. We went ahead, I set up a space for them in our FBI space. We were able to go ahead and go through that process again of those remaining items. And so we made contact with those folks and said, do you want this back? Some said yes, some said no. The ones that said yes, that we could clean, those have already been returned. The ones that said that they did not want, they wanted stuff back, but we had to send off to a third-party vendor, that is in my ERT bay right now. I'm just, in fact, when I return, that'll be something I'll be working here in the next couple of weeks, returning these items before the next anniversary of this shooting, which is coming up in November. And this is just a little, it just shows you what we do. We're very careful to catalog everything. It's very important that we are meticulous in our record planning. Right? Same thing, more packaging. This is, again, months after the fact, after that incident occurred. These are some of the items that were initially collected as evidence that now we've sent off to be cleaned to third-party vendors. And now that's been done, and now we just need to return it. And this is actually Sutherland Springs. So Sutherland Springs looked a lot like this sanctuary. Red carpet, again, just 2 rows. It was just devastated by this act. So as soon as we were able to clear this scene, the community hired a vendor, and that's what they transformed that sanctuary now into. It's painted all white, and each of those chairs and roses represents one of the victims inside that sanctuary. And then there was, again, like here in Birmingham, like happened with the Sikh temple, the same thing happened in Sutherland Springs. There was just an outpouring of support from all over the world. And so have built a new sanctuary just behind the original place where the shooting occurred. So they're going to leave that as a memorial to the victims of Sutherland Springs. It's quite amazing. And so that in a nutshell is all I wanted to share with y'all. Just let you know that even though these things are horrendous, evil acts, we in the FBI, not only are we trying to partner with our law enforcement partners and help them get through that situation, but we're also thinking of the victims and how we can help them through this process as well. That's all I have, folks. Any questions? Thank you very much, people. I appreciate it. Oh, sorry. So the question is, are we collecting these personal effects while the victims are still there? Yes, in some cases we are. In other cases, once we remove the body, we may be doing that at the morgue. It depends on the situation and whether it makes sense for us to collect it right there and right there and now, or if we can move it somewhere else. Obviously, we are trying to be very sensitive to those around who might see this too, right? So sometimes it makes sense for us to do what we need to do, which is, for example, document where the bodies are, where everything's at, that type of thing, before we move the bodies. Then we take them to, in this case, we had a makeshift morgue right next to the church, and we worked in there. We're trying to keep it out of the public eye, because that's not something that anybody wants to see, and we certainly don't want to have next of kin see that. We don't want to have anybody see that type of thing. So we're very careful what we do, and everything has its time and place. There's a procedure. So we're not going to do anything before it's time or proper for us to do it. And the other thing that we do, and that's I want to just mention when it comes to the removal of the remains or the bodies from the system, we want to try to do that as quickly as possible. So we're always trying to be efficient and quick about what we need to do, because there's a lot of people who have a vested interest in knowing what happened to their loved ones in there. And the Fort Hood shooting, the military, we wanted to be respectful and get those bodies out of there as soon as possible so that the military could start its process of honoring their fallen service members. And in the church, we want to do the same thing. We want to try to work as quickly as possible to get those bodies out of there so that the process can begin with dealing with the things that need to be dealt with when you have a deceased loved one. Great question. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, folks. Appreciate your time.
Well, it has been a full 2 days. That actually was the last presentation of Hate in Our House, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, FBI Birmingham Division conference on hate in places of worship, hate crimes in places of worship. We've learned so much about history, about the timing, about hearing what's happening in history, praying that things don't repeat themselves, but knowing that through partnership with the faith-based community, with our law enforcement and our community members who have been so faithful to have participated and learned this knowledge. My hope is, certainly as a journalist, that we will be able to take what we've learned and to share it with the public so the public can figure out ways that they too can help and prevent some of the things that have happened from happening again. And I think, my overall takeaway from this is that love conquers hate. It is greater than hate. So I want to thank you for allowing me to participate and learn along with you. This concludes the conference. Thank you for coming. Have a great day. And feel free to tune in tonight on the news at 5, 6, and 10. Definitely 5 o'clock, we're going to have a live interview with Special Agent in Charge, Johnny Sharp, with the Birmingham FBI Division. And see you next year.